Professor J. Budziszewski received a PhD from Yale University. He is professor of government and philosophy at the University of Texas at Austin. Among his research interests are classical natural law, conscience, moral character, family and sexuality, and religion and public life, authentic versus counterfeit versions of toleration and liberty, and the unraveling of our common culture. That's a pretty good portfolio. However, he is most well known for his work on moral self-deception, or what's termed the revenge of conscience. What happens when we tell ourselves that we don't know what we really do know? His numerous books, including On the Meaning of Sex, Commentary on Thomas Aquinas, Treatise on Law, and How to Stay Christian in College, are among his works. And he maintains a personal scholarly website and daily blog, The Underground Thomist, at www.undergroundthomist.org. And I think he wins the title of the decade for his What We Can't Not Know, Professor Budziszewski.
Well, thank you very much. I thought that he was going to say I win the title of the decade for the most unpronounceable name. I'm very glad to be with you here today. I really am. I know speakers say that, but it is really true. And I'm grateful to the Wheatley Institution for sponsoring this conference and inviting some of us to have the opportunity, the privilege to speak to you. This is a mixed students. I know that there are students here, faculty, community. Allow me to speak first to you students. I'm told here that at BYU, most of you expect to marry. Let me put that there where it's not going to fall apart. Most of you expect to marry. Marriage takes place fairly early in life. My wife and I were married quite young ourselves, at 19 years of age. Although even among you, I guess it doesn't take, or with me, marriage doesn't take place as early as it did with our ancestors, which was really pretty soon after puberty. Many of you are married already. You expect to have children. The idea of a deliberately childless marriage would be strange to you. In short, you have a culture of marriage and of childbearing which the university encourages. Good. I'm glad to hear it. Though I speak as a friend, I would guess that here, as everywhere, there is probably some disorder beneath the surface, that some of your friends are leading double lives, that even some who are outwardly compliant with these norms might, shall we say, have their own definitions of compliance. I would guess that what I say is not a surprise to you. No group of human beings escapes original sin. You would have to be sealed in vacuum jars to escape completely from the surrounding culture, which is profoundly confused about sexuality, marriage, and family. And I should think that that's one of the reasons for having a conference like this in the first place. See, you're not exempt, and you know this, I'm not patronizing you, you're not exempt from the need for encouragement to resist these corrosive influences, to know how to speak to your own friends, even if you're clear, they may be confused, and to build a stronger culture of marriage. Well, there exist strong pro-marriage and family traditions in many of the communities to which I speak from time to time. For example, among faithful Catholics like me, among Protestant fundamentalists, among some of the Dutch Reformed communions, and among LDS folks such as yourselves. But I found as I travel around the country that there's a difference between having strong pro-marriage and pro-family traditions and having familiarity with the rational basis of these traditions, isn't there? That's why I've been invited here to speak with you about them. My topic is the natural laws of sex, and in general, the principles of sexuality that, as I would describe it, are woven into the creational pattern of human beings. I'm going to try to speak in the language of common sense, rather than in the technical knowledge of natural law philosophy, but the way that I try to appeal to common sense is, of course, shaped by those theories. Now, of course, to speak about creation, as I did a moment ago, the creational design of human beings is to imply the creator, but I'm going to discuss what I think can be known just by reasoning and by rational reflection, which is common ground between us, not about what can be known only by divine revelation. Now, my own students at the University of Texas, I would say, show signs of exhaustion. I think this is very widespread in our culture today. In the 1980s, if I suggested in class, I don't usually have to bring up anything like this myself, people do themselves. If you're reading Plato, topics of sexuality are inevitably going to come up. If you're talking about political policies, these topics are going to come up. There are 1,000 things that bring these things up. If I suggested in class, though, in the 1980s that there might be any problem with sexual so-called liberation, well, my students would say, well, everything's fine. What are you talking about? Now, if I raise questions, many of them speak differently. They still tend to live as libertines, as a matter of fact, living what I would describe as much more disordered lives even than in that decade. But I can see that it's getting old. It's getting old. My generation may have ordered the meal of the sexual revolution, but theirs is paying the tab. You might think so many people who speak about these things talk only about medical consequences of disordered sexuality or unwanted pregnancies, but consider, for example, splintered childhoods. What is it like for your family to break up because dad has found someone new? What is it like to break up again because mom has? What is it like to be passed from step-parent to step-parent to step-parent? I know a little girl who says, I don't even know how many stepbrothers and stepsisters I have. She'd been passed around so much. What is it like to grow up knowing that you would have had a sister, but she was aborted? A young man remarked in one of my classes once, this moved me in part because of the poignancy of his expression. He didn't just say, I desire. He said, I long. I long to get married, to love a woman and get married to her and stay married to this woman forever. But because his own parents hadn't been able to manage it, he was afraid to get married at all. He said, I don't think it's possible. The ideology of hooking up says that sex is nothing but release or recreation. You have some friends for companionship, you have some other friends just for sex. What your body does is supposed to be unrelated to your heart, unrelated to your mind, unrelated to any longer-term intentions. Don't believe it. We aren't designed, we aren't made for that kind of thing. Our hearts and bodies are meant to work together. And I think that is something that a statement like that tends to resonate more strongly with women. But I'm speaking of men and women both. A woman may be more likely to cry the next morning because the guy didn't even call her. But a man pays a price too. He probably feels a diminished sense of his own manhood. He probably also thinks that he can use women as tools and yet somehow remain capable of romantic intimacy when the right woman comes along. And that's just not how it works. Sex is like applying adhesive tape. Promiscuity is like ripping the tape off again. Maybe you did that when you were a kid. You put the tape on your arm and you pull it off, and you put it on and you pull it off, and you experiment with all kinds of silly things like kids putting objects in their mouths. Well, if you rip it off, and I'm speaking of sex now, if you rip it off and stick it on and rip it off and stick it on and rip it off and stick it on and rip it off again, eventually the tape can't stick at all. You lose the very capacity for romantic intimacy. Now, in a roundabout sort of way, I've just introduced the concept of natural law, at least as I understand it. Although the natural law tradition, the classical tradition, is unfamiliar to most people in our culture today, it was the main axis of Western ethical thought for 23 centuries, and in fact it's experiencing a sort of a renaissance, a modest renaissance. It's not as though it's storming the culture, but heads are rising again. Academics and even some policymakers and people in other branches of our society are beginning to notice the hinge concept is meaning and design. Those things I've been talking about. I said we're not designed for hooking up, that sex ought to mean something more than this, that we're designed for our bodies and hearts to work together. Well, we really do have a design, we human beings. And I'm not using the word design just in a mechanical sense. This part goes here, that part goes there. I'm not talking about bolts and nuts. The design isn't just biological, it's emotional and intellectual and volitional and spiritual. Some ways of living harmonize with it. And some ways of living just don't. From a natural law perspective, the problem with 21st century Western sexuality is that it flouts the embedded principles and the inbuilt meanings of the human sexual design. Have you ever pulled your fingernails across a blackboard? Well, then you know what I mean. So, what are the natural meanings and purposes embedded in the human sexual design? And how do they make music together? In particular, we might put it this way: what are the sexual powers for? Well, according to the classical tradition, they have exactly two purposes. One is procreation, the bringing about and the nurture of new life, the turning of the wheel of the generations, the formation of families in which children have moms and dads. This isn't something that's considered apart from love. It is an aspect of love. And that leads to the second purpose, which is union, the mutual and total, as Melissa put it, the mutual and total self-giving and accepting of two polar, complementary selves, a man and a woman, in their entirety, soul and body. These two meanings, procreation and union, are so tightly stitched that if we follow the threads from either one of them, we will get to the other. They are a package deal. They are sewn together so tightly that if we try to separate them and have procreation without union or union without procreation, we are tearing ourselves. Now, you might ask, why these purposes? This is a question I often get from my own students. If I say, what is this all about, they may say something like that. But sometimes they'll say, well, pleasure. The first thing that they may say is pleasure. It's funny. I get different answers depending on the order in which I pose the questions. If I say, why do we have eyes? They'll say, well, for seeing. Now, looking at beautiful things is, even just looking at things, is pleasurable, but they don't say the purpose of the power of vision is pleasure. If I say, why do we have muscles? They're not going to say, well, for pleasure, although, of course, stretching my muscles, stretching in the morning is pleasurable. If I say, well, why do we have powers of ingestion, of taking in food? They'll say, well, that's for nutrition. That's what it's all about. That's why you have those powers. Other things supervene on them, like the opportunity to have a meal together with your friends. But the purpose of them isn't pleasurable. They are pleasurable. The exercise of every voluntary power is pleasurable, but that's not what they're all about. It's pleasurable to eat, pleasurable to breathe, even pleasurable to flex the muscles of the leg. But the problem is that eating is pleasurable even if I'm eating too much. Breathing is pleasurable even if I'm sniffing glue. Flexing the muscles of the leg is pleasurable even if I'm kicking the dog. What this shows is that in order to know when it's good to enjoy each pleasure, each distinctive kind of pleasure, we have to look beyond the mere fact that it is pleasurable. Suppose we were to say that since eating is pleasurable, the purpose of eating must be pleasure. You go to Grandma's house and you have Thanksgiving dinner, and when you can't eat another bite, Grandma leads you into a little room with porcelain basins where you purge so that you can have the pleasure of eating yet another course. Well, I hope it's not difficult to recognize that behavior like that would be profoundly disordered. But that's just how our society views sex. It misses the point. It misses the point. So yes, although we do experience pleasure in exercising our sexual powers, and that's good, pleasure is not their purpose. It only provides a motive for using them. Helpful but sometimes dangerous motive, which may sometimes conflict with their true purposes and steer us wrong. Our bodies are not just tools for sending agreeable sensations to our minds. They are of inestimably greater dignity than that, for they are part of what we are. Now, I was saying that the two purposes of the sexual powers are procreation and union. Apart from the fact, that sex brings about new human life, it would be difficult to understand why human beings have sexual powers at all, why they have sexual powers at all. But once the procreative meaning of sex is granted, the unitive meaning follows. Among human beings, you can't think about these things separately. It makes no sense. We aren't made like guppies, which cooperate only for a moment. For us, procreation involves an enduring partnership between two beings, the man and the woman, who are naturally complementary to each other. I don't mean they complement each other. You're looking nice today, dear. I mean that they are complements. Each provides something that is missing together. They are different, but different in ways that enable them to complete and to balance each other. There is something missing in the man which is more fully present in the woman, something partly missing in the woman which is more fully present in the man. A mom is not the same thing as a dad, and a child needs them both. Mom and dad are jointly irreplaceable. In fact, their partnership in procreation continues, have you thought about it, even after the children are grown? You might think, well, there's no more, they finished their job. No, they haven't finished their job. The procreation is a multi-generational activity. They now need to help their grown kids, offer their own help and counsel as the children establish their own new families. Part of this is the meaning of being grandparents. As Melissa said, the husband and the wife give themselves to each other. They give themselves to each other. And the more I think about this mutual gift of self, the more astonishing it seems. New life, this is how it is among some organisms, new life could have been brought about without sex, as it is in yeast and bacteria. Amoebas, maybe we might divide, or perhaps we might bud. A little fellow might begin growing from under my arm, out of the way, and he's sort of hanging on a little string, and day by day dangling there, he grows bigger and he grows more mature, and finally he would break off from the stem and drop off and run away. Or perhaps new human life could have been brought about with sex, but without the gift of self, as in those guppies I mentioned. But it isn't. For us human beings, just because of the way that we are essentially made to realize the potentiality for new life, sex carries with it a second potentiality, a potentiality for a powerful and distinctive form of human life, of human love, different from all the other forms of human love, the only form of human love which is consummated by sexual union. This is why it shakes us to the core. This is why it says, now you will never be the same. Whenever the spouses give themselves to each other sexually, they are doing something which also cannot help but mean that happy chance of new life. The meaning of the act is not something that they are free to simply make up for themselves, just as we are not free to make up all of our duties and all of our special obligations to others. Some of it comes with the package. Even if that isn't their subjective intention, they can't change the objective meaning of the act. For a bodily action is like a word. You mean things to each other not only by what you say, but even by what you do. In fact, when the speech of the mouth contradicts the speech of the body actually repeals the speech of the mouth. Do you know what I mean? If I crush your windpipe with my thumbs, what I'm saying to you by that act is, now die. Even if I'm telling you with my mouth, be alive. And even if in some hallucinatory sense that's what's in my mind. To join in one flesh is to say, I give myself to you in all that this act means, even if my mouth shapes the words. This means nothing. Do you see where this leads? For two persons to give themselves to each other totally is to give what they are wholly. What they are wholly includes their bodies. And into these bodies is written the potentiality to bring a third person into being. It is an intrinsic part, then, of what they give and receive. Now let me explore another part of this mystery. What makes the mutual gift of self possible is that the two selves have something to give. What do I mean by that? I'm not just talking about the shallower forms of complementarity, as though my friend knows more about electronics and I know more about classical music, and we share interests in that way. Remember what we were talking about just a minute ago. The man and the woman are naturally complementary. By nature, there is something partially missing in the man which he finds in the woman, and something partially missing in her which he finds in him. By themselves, each one is incomplete. To be whole, they have to be united. The gift of self makes each self to the other self what no other self can be. The gift of self makes each self to the other self what no other self can be. The fact that they, quote unquote, forsake all others is not just a sentimental feature of traditional Western marriage vows, then. It arises from the very nature of the gift. You can't give yourself partly because yourself is indivisible. You can't divide yourself into two. And so the gift of self can't be divided either. The only way to give yourself is to give yourself entirely. Because the gift is total and because it joins the very flesh which individuates us, it excludes all others. If it doesn't exclude all others, then the gift has not taken place. How powerful this is. The body is the visible sign by which the invisible self is actually made present and communes with the other self. The body is an emblem of the person, and the joining of their bodies emblematizes the joining of the persons. One flesh unity is the body's language for one life union. How strange that, and how mystifying that two such different and incomplete beings must come together. Why should there be such an ontological gap between the two sexes, considering that it takes such an effort to bridge it? You know, little boys and little girls, each of them think the other is covered with cooties, and it actually takes effort. With the assistance of puberty, all of those chemical rushes help to realize that there is to help us to overcome this gap and to see the advantage. Why isn't there just one complete sex that combines all the male and female qualities instead of two incomplete sexes who need to balance and compensate for each other? You would almost think that we were designed the way we are just so that we would have this difficulty to overcome. Well, wait a moment. Could that, in a way, be true? Could there be something good about having this difficulty to overcome? I think the answer is yes. The polarity and incompleteness of the two sexes is a blessing. The first way is this. You might say, how could it be a blessing to be incomplete? But it's a blessing in at least two ways. The first way is that it makes it possible. The difference between us makes it possible for us to complement each other. You can't give someone what he already has. You can only make a gift if there is something to give him that he doesn't have. You can only give him what he doesn't have. So men and women in general, and the husband and wife in particular, have to be different from each other and different in just such a way that they balance, each providing what the other lacks. Certain soft chords in her nature resonate more powerfully in his. Certain pale hues in his nature glow more luminously in hers. Paradoxically, we're not less because of this incompleteness. We are more. There is more beauty and laughter in the world because there are two kinds of us who cooperate in this way. Two melodies playing in harmony, in polyphony. Surprising, isn't it? You would think that the ontological gap would make the communion of two different versions of the human being impossible. And actually, that gap is the very thing that makes it possible. The second way in which the polarity and incompleteness of the sexes is a blessing is that it provides not just the possibility, but the motive for the two persons to cross that ontological gap. Feeling their incompleteness, the two sexes long for each other. Now, of course, there are other ways to use the sexual powers, and I mean use. Other ways to try to dissipate that longing, ways that in the end cannot bridge that canyon and may not even try to. One way would sink me more deeply into me. Another way would attach me to something like my own reflection. Still another way would reduce other people to my tools instead of my regarding them as intrinsically worthy in themselves. But none of these ways would help me to climb out of the deep brick-lined well of myself. In fact, each of these ways makes the steep walls of that well even steeper. By contrast, the union of the two opposite sexes draws a person to forget himself in care and in sacrifice for someone who is truly and strangely other, not altogether other. Men and women are both human beings, but yet other. You might say that we find ourselves then by losing ourselves. That's a principle that has application in many different domains, but it does here. These facts also highlight the importance of sexual purity for those who are not married. Too often, chastity is misunderstood. We tend to think of it as though it were a pure negative, a no, or a not, or a never, lacking any character of its own. A vacuum. Don't take from that box of chocolates. You may not have one. Well, it is true that continent singles do say no to genital activity, but singles who have really grasped the virtue of purity aren't just not doing something. They are embarked on the doing of something. By living as they do, they are pursuing goods of beauty and integrity, which impurity undermines and sullies. Purity in single people bears an analogy, and I think it is a deep analogy, to purity in married couples. You might say, in married couples, but they're doing what the chaste singles aren't doing. Well, no, not exactly. Chaste married couples say no to something too. They aren't abstaining from intercourse, but they're abstaining from unfaithfulness. People often falsely imagine that continence is something that is limiting to single people. Oh, what I'm missing out on because I can't have sex. You even hear from teenagers sometimes, I have to have sex before I die. Would any sane person say that faithfulness is limiting to married people? I mean, in a certain literal sense, it is a limit. One must not pass this barrier. One must not be unfaithful. But it's in another sense, it is not a limit at all. That would be like saying avoiding false notes limits melody. Or that confining yourself to playing the music in the right key limits the symphony. Avoiding false notes doesn't limit melody. It is the very thing that makes melody possible. Faithfulness doesn't limit marriage. It is one of the very things that makes marriage possible. And continence doesn't limit singleness. It is the very thing that makes the dignity of the single estate possible. What I'm suggesting is that continence belongs to the integrity of the single estate in the same way that faithfulness belongs to the integrity of the married estate. By practicing continence, single persons can see things in their true loveliness instead of through an obscuring haze of desire and complications of life that introduce alien motives into every activity of their lives. They can keep from being jerked around by their passions. They can have the inner freedom to pursue whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely and gracious, whatever is worthy of praise. Contemporary culture lies to us about that. But contemporary culture lies to us not only about those things, but about something else too. It tells us that if we are chaste, then we're being false to our sexuality. False to our sexuality, that we're repressing ourselves, that we're turning ourselves into neuters. That's not even remotely true. Wasn't Mother Teresa of Calcutta, was she less a woman because she didn't have sexual intercourse? She seemed quite a woman to me. Did she give the impression of being deprived by not sampling that box of chocolates? Chastity didn't neuter her, it uplifted everything about her, including her femininity. It made it glow in more vibrant colors. That may seem strange. How could chastity uplift anyone's femininity? The answer is that the polarity of the two sexes isn't just about sexual intercourse. Consider just a woman. A woman is someone who is, I speak not of everything about her, but about what distinguishes her from the man. A woman is someone who is in potentiality for motherhood. As Alice von Hildebrand has put it, even though not every woman is called to marry and bear physical children, she says, I quote, "Every woman, whether married or unmarried, is called upon to be a biological, psychological, or spiritual mother." Von Hildebrand points out that women intuitively grasp the profound importance of caring for others, suffering with and being for them. For maternity, she says, again quoting, implies suffering for others. This is a profound insight, and it belongs to the genius, I'm using the term in the old-fashioned sense, the genius of womanhood, the spirit of womanhood. If you'll allow me to build on this line of reasoning, though, then I'd like to suggest that just as a woman who is someone who is in potentiality for motherhood, a man is someone who is in potentiality for fatherhood. Just as motherhood is broader than biological motherhood, so fatherhood is broader than biological fatherhood. Just as not all women are called to marry and bear physical children, and so not all men are called to marry and sire physical children, yet just as all women are called to motherhood, in a larger sense, so all men are called to fatherhood in a larger sense. Our grasp of this fact, especially in a society as confused and as dissolute as ours, is weakened by the fact that in most branches of our world, we've lost the rights and the customs of apprenticeship and of coming to age. Some of our speakers spoke about this yesterday. And by the fact that so many of us today have grown up with an impaired relationship with our fathers. Yet, unfashionable as it is to say so, men naturally desire to be not Johns, not overgrown children, but something like knights, who not only do hard things, but who in a firm and fatherly manner train others so that they can do hard things too. A man will more readily aspire to manhood if he can somehow taste the flavor of valor in it. If all goes well, then this is true not only in how he carries himself toward other men, but also of how he carries himself toward women, because among other things, a knight is a guardian. I spoke a few minutes ago of the genius of womanhood. I think this is the genius of manhood. Now, because of these differences, men and women have to teach each other. A woman knows intuitively that in order to be strong, you have to love. A man may need some help with that, but he knows intuitively that in order to love, you have to be strong. She knows that even boldness needs humility. He's more likely to grasp that even humility needs to be bold. He is perhaps a living emblem of that justice, which is tempered by mercy. She is an animate symbol of that mercy, which is tempered by justice. To her, sexual purity represents itself as a treasure to be protected. Of all of the images that we have in our treasury of images and metaphors and pictures, that we cherish, that one tends to make more sense to her. To him, it presents itself as a sexual purity, though, tends to present itself more often as a quest to be undertaken. For you see, it's one of those hard things. It's one of those hard things. Everything that we've talked about concerns sexuality. But none of it necessarily requires having sex. Why then is there sex? And I mean, in the sense, why then have we human beings been divided into two polaric kinds? The answer, I think, is a paradox. We were divided into two so that we could learn to make a more perfect whole than if we were only one. Yes, we were divided into two so we could learn to make a more perfect whole than if we were only one. This isn't a truth only for married persons. This is a truth even for singles, for all persons, for the married and faithful in one way, and for the single and the chaste in another, because each sex, even if chaste and unmarried, has to learn to give encouragement to the other and take joy in the fact that there are two kinds of us in the world. How many more colors there are in the world because there are two sexes and not just one. How much more music there is, how much more tang, how much more humor. We're ridiculous to each other. I expect men and women to remain baffling to each other in many ways, yet even this mutual perplexity can be a fountain of mirth, making the shimmering hues of strangeness sparkle all the more. No matter whether we're called to the married or the single state of life, if we can delight in this fact, if we can make merry in it, if we can enjoy being mutually ridiculous, then all of us together can live in a deeper joy. I speak of joy. To many of my audiences, that seems almost inconceivable. In teaching Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, I used to follow his first chapter, and I got to a point where they agreed that happiness or fulfillment is that toward which all human acts are directed. And I would say, well, then what is happiness? And they would suggest answers with grains of truth in them that may be wrong, and we'd take the next step that Aristotle took. They would say to me things like happiness is having friends, or happiness is virtue, or happiness is pleasure, or happiness is this, or happiness is that. The last couple of times I've asked my students, though, they give different answers. Do you know what they say? It breaks my heart. The first time this happened, the first half dozen students who answered merely gave variations on the answer. Happiness is nothing but the absence of pain. Happiness is nothing but the answer to pain. How must you have been living to have burned out like that so young? Usually, philosophers sometimes call this the hedonistic paradox. If you make pleasure your aim in life, you won't have any. If you confuse it with happiness, then you won't have what you think happiness is either. It usually hits people more around, if they live hedonistic lives, around the age of 35. They must have started early, and the grown-ups in their lives must have encouraged it. People today do so much to kill joy that you would think that they don't want it. Don't believe it. People do want joy. All humans do. That's why in the long run, it may be the very long run, I hope not, but in the long run, the sexual revolution has no future. We are put together in such a way that although we can be pushed and pulled and drowsied by the flickering images of joyless desire, we cannot be satisfied by them. We know too much, even in oblivion. Fallow knowledge troubles our sleep. We lie under the prickling enchantment of the law written on our hearts, which is stronger than the counterspell and can never quite be scratched out. The way and the life lie nowhere but in the truth, and I hope we can walk in it together. Thank you.